Hello everyone and welcome to Piedmont Trails. Today's video is going to be about migration patterns, primarily through the 18th century, the 1700s, and into the mid-section of the 19th century, from 1800 to approximately 1850. How many of you have conducted family history research and have came across your ancestor and all of a sudden the records stop? There are no more records. You quickly realize that your ancestor must have traveled from some other location to that point. But where did they travel from? Migration patterns have occurred all throughout our nation's history since the beginning of our first established settlement during the 17th century. Migration patterns occurred in various different levels, and they mainly can be contributed solely to land and the availability of land. One of the greatest first migration patterns that occurred between the years of 1750 and 1770 was known as the Southern Migration, which occurred from the middle colonies and traveled south to the southern colonies, mainly in the North Carolina area. Several roads were used for this particular migration, and hundreds of thousands and tens of thousands of families traveled during this time period. Another great migration pattern occurred right after the American Revolutionary War, which would have been between the years of 1790 and 1810. And a lot of this can be contributed to the veterans of the American Revolutionary War receiving land bounty warrants in the wilderness frontier of the western lands that was just recently being opened. Again, coming back to the availability of land. When we move forward into the mid-19th century, we see the vast openings of the prairie states. And now migration is continuing forward with the Homestead Act of 1860 allowing the availability of land. So this becomes our main primary target when we're researching our ancestors and going back in time and understanding colonial status and how the colonial class worked and what it meant to our ancestors. Because these standards were passed down from generation to generation. And so what did it really mean to own land during the colonial years? Colonial status was divided by class. And if you owned property, you were then available to vote. If you did not own property, you weren't allowed to vote. This was during the colonial time period. So the main objectives for our ancestors were prosperity, to prosper themselves, and to be the owner of land or property. This enticed so many of our ancestors to travel and migrate to other areas. And as I just recently stated about the southern migration, there were tens of hundreds of thousands of families during these years of the colonial period who took it upon themselves to travel from the middle colonies and northern colonies to the southern colonies. So where did they go from there? Many, as Tennessee and Kentucky opened up during the years between 1780, 1790, and really into the 1800 and 1810. Many of the families migrated there, and you will discover as you research, more and more families would stay temporarily in certain locations, and then later they would pick up and migrate and move again. So how can you trace these footsteps? You have to start at the last known record that you have on hand. And not only that, for paying a close attention to that particular record, but then you have to look outside of the box and look at all the neighbors and families and friends of your ancestor and look into their records as well. And the reason that I say this is because majority of our ancestors during this time period traveled in groups, and they traveled together with family, friends, neighbors. They traveled in groups. So if one group is arriving at a particular location in Indiana during the year of 1800, then you can find out exactly who was involved in that group. and where they settled. Most of the time, majority of the time, they would settle close to one another. Not always, but majority of the time they would originally start out settling together and then eventually branching out. From the 1750s, you will find majority of our that were involved with the southern migration originated from either New Jersey, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New York. You can find some others. That's not to say that others didn't travel from other northernmost colonies, but the majority of them came from those areas. They traveled first into North Carolina. I've had many family members who traveled through Virginia, stayed a little while, stayed a brief period in Virginia, and then traveled into North Carolina, and then acquired land in North Carolina, eventually left after the American Revolutionary War, went to lands in Kentucky and Tennessee, further west over into Indiana, and even further west from there. The Northwest Territory was a prime example of the Western migration era, and this mainly occurred between 1780 and 1790, the originally start of this, and it continued. And as these areas of the Ohio River in Indiana and present-day Illinois grew and were allotted for lots to individuals, further west they go. Learning the history of the early roads can also give you great insight on how these migration patterns occurred. And once you discover your ancestor, say for instance you are researching in the Kentucky area and you realize that your ancestor migrated from Virginia, you go to that small community in which your ancestor lived and really dig into the history of that area. If you do that, then you can discover possible reasons why your ancestor left this particular area to go elsewhere. How did word of mouth get around about the migration patterns? What led our ancestors to understand what was available and what wasn't? They would be social gatherings. That would be ordinary daily talk at the local tavern. It would also come about in publications. There have been publications found that date back to this era that entice and, so to speak, advertise of what lands are available in certain areas. North Carolina was advertised. Areas of Georgia were advertised that I can think of. So publications were also a great tool that allowed our ancestors to learn about the lands that were available. So land seems to be the number one thing. If you have a time frame and you've not been able to locate your ancestor, we'll come up with 1830. And you've researched into Indiana in 1830, all of a sudden the records stop. So you start thinking about, was there anyone in this family who was associated with the American Revolutionary War? Were they receiving a pension in 1830? And I would start with there, and then I would work my way back. And who were their neighbors, and where did they, see if you can find more records about their neighbors and where they came from. To learn more about migration patterns, I invite everyone to visit the censusbureau.gov website. It gives you a great deal amount of information about the population of our nation's history and how the colonies derived into states and how the states' populations varied from decade to decade. And it will greatly guide you along the route in determining your migration routes for your ancestors. Also take in consideration of church and religious organizations. Oftentimes entire congregations would pick up, or a portion of the congregation would pick up their things and they would travel elsewhere and establish a new church, and the congregation would travel together. And you can follow this along with Baptist records and Methodist records, which holds a huge archive of journals and diaries of personal migration patterns and routes taken. And like I said, the early roads will also guide you in a very good direction. Learning the history of these roads can give you so much more information, and it gives you a much better understanding of exactly what was going on during that particular time frame in which your ancestor traveled. This is short and it's sweet, and I hope that it helps you all in guiding you to the right direction in determining the migration patterns. Learn about the local history and on a ground level, and study the neighbors of your ancestor during the last location, and that will give you a starting point. It may take a little while, but I promise you it will give you a starting point in which you can begin your research, and then you can work backwards from there. Alright, thank you so much for joining me today, and be sure to hit the subscribe button for Piedmont Trails and join the journey. Our ancestors left an amazing trail to follow. Enjoy your journey today to the past.